Good afternoon. I'm so glad that you are able to join us here at SPP-TAP. We are funded by the California Department of Education to work on disproportionality and significant disproportionality throughout the state. Our long name is State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project. I'm here with our director, Connie Silva. This is Sharon Cavallaro. Susan is with us today, and so is James Johnson, the manager of FMTA 3 at California Department of Education. We're very fortunate to be able to bring you these webinars. This is our first of the year. I'd like to preface it by saying that those of us up here in Napa are no stranger to fire and smoke, and we want to express our sympathies and our concern and our care to all of you affected by smoke and fire, and to your family members as well. This is forefront in our minds. You'll see on your screen that we start with a greeting in our webinars, so please post in chat your name, your local education agency, that would be your district or county office, and the names of those who may be sharing your computer screen with you, those who are sitting with you. We welcome all of you. So many of you already know that SPP-TAP provides for you webinars, online learning. We have a lot of information on our website, and we also provide individualized technical assistance to local education agencies who may be interested in support from SPP-TAP. We ask you to participate in this webinar by using that chat box that we just talked about, and also participating in the polls. Please note that this webinar is being recorded so that we may post it on our website for future use. And now I get to have the immense honor to introduce you to Dr. Frances Stetson. Dr. Stetson is a national authority on inclusive practices in education and has been working with her team for over 3 decades on helping create more inclusive schools throughout the nation. Dr. Stetson is also a particular friend to California, having worked with many of our districts, both in the north and the south, and we are very excited to have her today with her topic, Addressing Disproportionality Through Inclusive Practices, a Call for Change and Purposeful Leadership.
Thank you, Sharon. I'm really pleased to be your presenter today on a topic that's of very great importance to your state and to the country. We're going to be looking at disproportionality for children of color, and we're also going to look at how that juxtaposes with inclusive practices. And luckily, there are a lot of lessons we can learn from inclusive practices that assist us in improving our outcomes with regard to disproportionate representation in our schools. So let's begin. I have thought this through and thought about 2 major components of the legislation for children with disabilities, and realized as I was preparing for this webinar that actually there are 2 components of the law: least restrictive environment, which you in California refer to as placement, least restrictive environment, and the second piece is that disproportionate representation. And when you really take them apart, they're almost indistinguishable with regard to the guarantees that they make that are made to children and their families to be with their non-disabled peers to the greatest extent appropriate. And so as we will look at both our practices for placement and for disproportionate representation, and we look at some of the data, which we shall do, then we're going to begin to identify how important it is for us to put some strategies in place that really turn some of these numbers around. So let's look further then, and recognizing that these two are very, very similar in their belief systems and in their guarantees. And as we look at that similarity, I think there are four basic ways, or I call them ahas, that these two components of the legislation really meld together. And the first one is that the foundational beliefs and the practices are the same, as we mentioned earlier. But one of the things that's really intriguing is that second point. As we look at the stages of evolution of both of these components, we recognize for both of them that there is racial, ethnic, and equity lags for both. We are not where we want to be with regard to either LRE or placement or disproportionate representation. So part of our presentation is going to look at the evolution of those practices and see what stage we're in and what it will take to move on to the next. The third aha about both of these is that highly effective instructional and behavioral approaches are really important remedies to the challenges that we're still facing. The notion that this is an administrative issue or something to do with simply testing or rearranging the deck chairs or something, no, it really does come down to improving our practice in terms of delivery of instruction and appropriate behavioral approaches. So I actually consider that the good news, because those represent strategies that educators really know well. So we'll be reviewing those. And finally, the ahas and the way that this presentation is organized is we're going to look at the gap between what is now today and really what should be, and we're going to have looked at that throughout the presentation. But I'd like to end with, for all of our conversation, the importance of the professional and the personal commitment that it will take to reverse some of the numbers that we have or to improve those numbers for children. And so I think that is a very fitting end in terms of what must we do both professionally and personally. All right, so let's begin so that we have a common vocabulary. Let's begin by looking at a very quick definition of both of those terms of disproportionate representation and placement, or LRE. The important thing for all of us to understand is that when we look at the concern at the federal and at the state level and at our own school district level as well, is that there is an important assumption that underlies disproportionate representation. And that is that the representation of ethnic and racial groups in special education should be reflective of their appearance in the total school population. And that actually is the case for many of your youngsters in your state, children who are classified as white, who are classified as Hispanic, and then you have children that are classified as Asian. And then when we look at the youngsters who are African American, we find that the representation or the numbers of those youngsters receiving special education services is not equal to or close to their actual representation in the general student population. It's much larger than it should be. And so to that we want to turn our attention. The definition, when you look at the federal definition of disproportionate representation, talks about 4 different areas that we would look at. Are youngsters, students of color, over-identified in specific disability categories? Are they placed more than their typical peers, their general peers, in more segregated settings? We're looking at, are they, what is the rate of suspension or expulsion? Is it as it should be per their place in the general population, or is it higher or lower? In this case, higher. And then, to what extent is that population of children represented in special ed? So we're going to be looking at some actual numbers in just a few minutes. But let's go on then, and let's juxtapose now the definition of least restrictive environment with that definition, and this is a guarantee, of course we all know, for every child with a disability is receiving special ed services. And the original language has never changed. It's the same as it's always been, but that students with disabilities shall be educated with their non-disabled peers to the greatest extent appropriate. So that's the language is very clear, and again, causes us some real concern when we are going to look at our data to see are youngsters, children of color, actually educated to the greatest extent appropriate with their non-disabled peers. But one of the things I wanted to point out, I find really interesting. I actually was in Washington, D.C. during the time of the authorization of 94-142 and the regulation writing, and served on one of those teams. And I realized as we've evolved in our school programs over the years, one of the things that we have a lot of people, including me, that say, wow, inclusive practices, LRE, is really, really challenging. They're very, very difficult to do. And it really has been, frankly, one of the areas of the law that's been most challenging to implement on a national scale. But the odd thing is, if you just look with me at that second sentence, the original work that was and the language that was put into this legislation is very clear. It is just like a recipe, and it tells us exactly how to implement more inclusive practices. Special classes, separate schooling, and other removal of children with disabilities from the regular ed environment. Now, this occurs only if the nature and severity of the disability is such that education in the regular class, and here comes the formula, beginning in the regular class, then can we use supplemental aids? Would that support the child's success in the classroom? Can we also look at other supports and services that might make that possible? So we'll be talking about a major reference point is the general education classroom. And so both of these definitions are going to be really important to us as we start really peeling back the layers and looking at our current data and our practices. Now, I chose this quotation from Mara Stepan-Shevin. She's a pioneer in the field of special education. I think she's currently at Syracuse. And I'm a real fan of hers. And this is a quotation from her. It says, and I'll read it for us because we'll be coming back to it. Inclusion is not about disability, nor is it about schools. Inclusion demands that we ask ourselves what kind of world we want to create. Again, not about just disability. It's a much broader concept than that. But what world we want to create. And so we'll be looking at that as we move through the presentation. And this takes me back to what I had mentioned earlier that will be the fourth step or component of this presentation. What professional, organizational, and personal commitments do we need to make regarding the world we want to create and the world we want to live in? It's really basic to both of these concepts. So I'd like to invite all of us to do something that I think for many of us it might be a new thought. And that is to cast inclusion in much broader terms. We've been really focused and narrow in looking at children with disabilities. We've not looked at how broad a concept it is, and I'd like for us to think it's bigger than just the statement of inclusion, or at least restricted environments. It's more complex than that. It's about abundance thinking, and we'll get to that in a little while when we talk about the extent to which we have positive expectations for children of color. It's about abundance rather than scarcity thinking. It's about access and opportunity, and it's really about how I respond to people who are different from me in our schools. And so I think there's a kind of a moral imperative, if you will, for changing the data that we currently have, and that is we all want to be called and known as inclusive educators. And so what work is it going to take for us to be able to move to that label so that we're all inclusive educators? So thinking about expanding the concept of inclusion, let's look at some of the bedrock beliefs. And in just a few minutes, we're going to be asking you to answer a question or two about your perception of the extent to which your own school faculty or your staff actually embrace the following bedrock beliefs. Okay, the first one is that all students are general education students. Well, that for some of us is still a lesson to be learned. I'm in schools all the time. I see hundreds and hundreds of classrooms every year, and I often still hear the special ed students, the general ed students, this student and that, the English language learners, and we're still really in our minds categorizing our youngsters rather than understanding that every child is a general ed student. Some students need additional supports in order to be successful in school. Another belief system that's really important is that we've got to make every decision on an individualized basis. One of the things that I have seen us all concerned about are repeat IEP goals over and over and over again. And one of the things we're recognizing is that we've got to really drill down deeper and really look a little bit more effectively at individual student needs. But what that statement is also speaking to is that we've often looked at a label and then we automatically make a decision about where that youngster goes. If we say a child has a learning disability, we'll often say, oh, then you go to resource. Or if we say, in some cases, if you have an emotional or behavioral concern, oh, you go down the self-contained behavior classroom. So we've often made decisions on the basis of labels, not on the basis of what the individual student needs. This is a major time we're making major progress in the United States and moving away from that. But the more we individualize, the more individual student success we're going to see. Another thing that's really important and related to the other two is, to what extent does the faculty believe that we share responsibility for all students? Most of us were raised in a very siloed system. We had the curriculum and instruction in one department, special ed in another, a Title I in another department. And so we've really siloed ourselves. So recognizing and embracing that we have a shared responsibility. Now we're going to talk about this fourth one quite a bit. And that is, these are bedrock beliefs now. Do we all recognize the power of our expectations for student success? And if we find that we have higher expectations for one group than another, we're going to have to act very decisively in ways that communicate to all students that we have equally high expectations for their success. That is a bedrock belief because it actually is predictive of student success. Okay, another one that's a very interesting one, I think, and it's certainly in the last 15, 20 years gotten more attention in the United States, and that's looking at the cultural proficiency continuum and looking at where we individually fall on that, along that continuum, everywhere from cultural destructiveness with statements like speak English, this is America, to cultural blindness, I don't notice any difference in children, they're all the same, and not really recognizing and appreciating or admitting we recognize the difference, all the way to the other end of a continuum in a really positive way is being culturally proficient. Very much understanding the differences in cultures, appreciating them, integrating them into our own lives, and so being highly culturally proficient. So I think this is a major piece of every teacher's responsibility, is to really make certain that we're very high on that cultural proficiency continuum. Another bedrock belief we're hoping that all faculties believe or ascribe to is that we have to be advocates for all students. Some of us are acting as though we're advocates for only a few. And that's some work that I see we have to do across our schools, is really looking at, again, that shared ownership for all students. Now, the next one is one that I wish I could ignore, but it's certainly there, and you know it is, and we talk about it when we're in schools together, is that sometimes we actually have adult issues that get in the way of student progress. And so when I sit down and problem solve with a faculty, we'll often have to be honest with ourselves and say, is this an adult issue we're talking about or a kid issue? If it's a student issue, we'll stay till midnight to solve it. But if it's an adult issue, like that's not my preference, or I don't really think that it's my role to teach diverse learners, or what have you, then we need to move on and get past that adult issue. So making certain those stay out of the way and don't block student progress. And then this is the motto of my firm, and you hear it a great deal from a lot of educators. There's no such thing as being excellent if we're not equitable. You know, years ago across the states, when we were just beginning to look at accountability, we say, wow, we're a great school. We get this great big banner out front, and we put it at, we get a lot of recognition. But before the different accountability standards were put into place, we could be only held accountable for the youngsters that we knew were pretty much going to do well on the test. And so we exempted, or I call it in Texas, where I'm from, we used to take kids on mystery field trips the day of testing, the kids that we weren't sure were going to do well. So if we're not able to achieve excellence and learning for all students, then we're really not going to be able to put that big plaque on our wall and say we're really an excellent school. So let's now move to the questions that we have that are related to these, and they're the beliefs, bedrock beliefs on your screen now. And what we want to do now is move to the question, which is the level of agreement for the bedrock beliefs by the whole of my school or LEA teaching faculty is what? Virtually all of them strongly agree. At least 80% strongly agree. 60%, 40%, almost no one is one of your choices as well. So please indicate for us so we kind of get a snapshot of what we're dealing with in terms of our challenges. Okay. It's always so interesting to look at these results, isn't it? All right. We still have some votes coming in, so I'll wait just a few minutes, seconds. All right. Well, while we're waiting on the rest of the responses, and I guess it's like voting day. You don't want to influence the rest of the votes by talking about it. But I see that we have a lot of really candid folks in the audience that are willing to say, and I think verify my own experience at this point, is that this actually, I believe, is one of the biggest challenges we have, is that the belief systems in our own schools are not aligned with, not always aligned with, the belief systems that will actually make it easier to address some of these challenges, because if it's an attitudinal issue or even a belief system that we have that we've not really taken out and examined, it's going to, you know yourselves as you're putting your data up that it is a real challenge to think how we're going to approach this. Now, I'll tell you something about your responses. There is an awful lot of work recently. This is a positive thing. There's a lot of literature recently that talks about strategies for working with resistance to change. If I don't believe any or many of those 8 belief systems or beliefs that we put up on the screen, then it's going to be very hard for me to, one, look critically at what I'm doing, decide what changes I need to make in my classroom or my school or my district, and then to actually embark on the learning it's going to require and the change in my practice. And so the belief system is enormous. So let me talk just a minute as we look at these, and the results show us that, wow, we have the highest percentage of those 40% or less agree to those beliefs, and that is a whopping 62% of us say that in our schools that we have 40% or fewer of our faculty that actually believe those boxes and those statements in the boxes. Good news, we don't have anybody, at least so far, that has said no one, almost no one, and that's usually how it goes too, because we usually have some very passionate people within every faculty that truly embrace these beliefs and are ready to serve as a helpful change agent in the process. The next percentage up was still, we have at least 60% agree, that's good, that's over the midpoint, and then only 7%, at least 80%, and then we have, so if you combine virtually all of them strongly agree to at least 80% strongly agree, it's only 11% of the total. So doesn't that tell us right now, no matter what role you play, when those of you who are participating in this webinar, the work that has to be done. So let me very quickly tell you some things that we know has to happen. The first thing is we have to surface those disagreements. We need to have faculty meetings. I brought you some tools today that I think you're really going to like, and it's going to give you an opportunity to have faculty-wide meeting, a faculty-wide meeting or more. There are several different options for you, where you can sit down and have a faculty meeting and actually have an opportunity for people to talk about their belief systems. And one of them has great quotations that they can walk to around the room, walk to them, and what all those that are posted and say, this is one I really believe in and why. And so to get people to really start talking about their belief systems. So opportunities to talk about them in a stress-free or certainly a completely safe environment where the norms say that it's safe for us to talk about what we're talking about. Another one is to be able to step up to the plate when someone says in our presence, gee, this year's going to be tough. I've really got a lot of kids with, and fill in the blank in my classroom, whatever the blank is filled in with. Then I've always, kind of went, oh, gee, I have to go look in another direction. And now I've learned that we have got to speak to that, because to say nothing is to agree. So for those that do have those belief systems, we have to raise it. And principals have to raise the non-negotiables for their schools. It is a non-negotiable that we own and feel responsible for all students. And principals have to say it out loud and say it often. So those are just 3 strategies that are important. All right, now let's look at the next question. Do we believe that the standards are interdependent on one another? In other words, those 8, and I'll even say when we're talking about disproportionality and inclusion, least restrictive environment, placement, whatever you choose to call it, do we believe they're independent on one another? Okay. Well, take a minute and indicate your votes. Okay. We have a few more votes that need to come in, please. Okay, that's a pretty strong number. I'd love to be able to visit with the individual that has said that they're not interdependent, because I'd love to hear your answer or why. And I'm kind of thinking it through. I know that we have the great majority that say they are. It is true that they are interdependent. I would pose this question when I thought about this one myself. Could I say I have an inclusive school if I have a disproportionate number of children of color who are in more, maybe over-identified as needing special ed, or over-identified in a particular disability category, or are receiving more punitive treatment. I could not say that I'm an inclusive school if that were true. And then we can flip it. If I'm working very hard to change my data around disproportionality, I think the first strategy I would pick would be to be implementing much more professional development around inclusion, because inclusion requires us to really think hard about what instructional and behavioral strategies we can use to help every student be successful, and to only approach the leaving general ed classroom to the extent that it's absolutely necessary and appropriate for individual students. So that the results for the second question are very much in line with my own thinking. All right, so let's then move on. Given that, we're going to start looking at evolution. And I'll tell you, I'll keep moving myself up in this chair. You'll notice me bob up and down from time to time. I'm very short, and so I keep sliding out of my chair. So what can I say? I'll just keep moving back. All right, this slide I think is real important. I couldn't believe it. This is clip art on the bottom. And normally I don't think of us getting material like this from clip art, but there it is. And if you look at, now think about children with disabilities, and think about also children of color, exclusion. At some point in our history, completely excluded from school. Then we moved to separation. Yes, you could come to school, but you had to stay separate. You had to go in the classroom in the portable building, or the classroom down the hall, or in a separate facility, a separate school in the case of our children of color. Then we moved to integration. And this is what a lot of folks kind of fixate on and think, wow, success. Not quite. In integration, you'll notice, okay, so they're in the school or even in the classroom, but we're still kind of grouping them in a little spot. They sit in the back of the room, or they off to the side with a teacher. And so they're just as segregated in that general ed class as they would be if they were down the hall. Now, the inclusion and certainly appropriate representation of all children in receiving any service you want to name would be like that last visual. So I really do like this very much, and I want to add that we're going to put a little overlay on top of it. And so that reminds us of certainly brings us back to our topic as we're looking at it today. And then I want to also put this banner up. Banner up. And the banner reminds us that we're talking about disability, race, language, all these different yes buts that we've sometimes heard in our society around culture, gender, sexual orientation, economic status. You can name a lot more, but anything that has caused youngsters or adults to be seen as a category that we wanted to control or contain in another environment or under different circumstances. So let's talk about what we're going to do with this theme of inclusion. Is that we're going to, the evolution, is we're going to look at 3 different phases of that evolution. And we're going to start with the first one, and that's known as physical inclusion. This is where we started. Back when November of 1975, when Public Law 94-142 was passed into legislation, I was in Washington, D.C. a year after that, and I had been working at the State Department of Education. And I remember that the day before that legislation was passed, that across our country, the majority of children with a disability who needed special ed services were actually sitting at home. They were not in school at all, and there was no compulsion for schools to invite them in. And so that's an important piece to remember, that we were there, and that looking at, are we even in the schools? And in fact, our first models were segregated models. We went to say, well, how do we make this happen? We had to go to state schools to look at some of those models. So this is important. The first stage was the physical inclusion. The next stage we call academic inclusion. And the language I'm going to cite here, many of you know by heart, but it was really earth-shattering back in 2007 because children with disabilities prior to that time had been within their own curriculum, their own setting. Typically, we had little worksheets and we had little functional skills curricula. And in 2007, when IDEA was reauthorized, suddenly this language that students with disabilities shall have access to and the opportunity to progress in the general curriculum. And most of us, everybody goes, what? Really? How do you make that happen? Because we had very low expectations. And so this shifted in terms of our focus on really instructional quality and behavioral supports quality, so that we were really, really expecting and achieving much higher results for our youngsters within the general curriculum that everyone else participated in. So fine, in 2007 that was huge, and it still is, I may say. We're still, some of our educators are still using curricula that does not match our state curriculum. Now, today, I'm going to tell you that what we would call this phase, this last one, and it probably won't be the last one. It probably is going to be, there'll be another one right behind it. But this is called social, cultural, and racial inclusion. This is, in 2018, and certainly for many years before this actually, we've been looking at disproportionality. And we've also been looking at the reality that children who are different are often not included as real members of the school community. So we're going to start looking at these a little bit more detail, but what I want to prepare you for is that, because I want you to, now that you've shared with us where the attitudes or the belief systems sit in many of your schools, I'm believing that the box to the left that says current practice may be more in line with what you're seeing in your schools as you move toward our next box. It's always important to know what we're trying to move to. So currently, we're often very label-driven in our decisions. We see a child with as I said earlier, with a learning disability. We go, oh, you go down the hall to the resource room for reading and math, whether they need it or not. Or if a child has an intellectual disability, you go down the hall to the life skills class. And that's place-driven as well. Today, current practice for most states is that we have some problems, and some are significant around disproportionate representation. We often staff by looking at ratios and formulas. If I have 10 of these students, I get one teacher and one instructional assistant. If I have a higher number, I get even more. So we often make staffing decisions on the basis of ratios and formulas versus what the students actually require. Many of us have the philosophy, the more staff, the better, and adult proximity is sometimes viewed as an effective intervention. I'll just put a paraeducator to go stand next to that child, and she'll begin learning, or he'll begin to behave, and so we see adult proximity as an effective intervention. So now, this is the direction we're going. A fully shared vocabulary, and may I add the phrase belief system, so there's work to be done. Also, an objective but really student-centered focus, so that we're not just looking at the label. The label is less than helpful, I think, in many cases. It does give us some information, but what about the student? What does this individual student require? Instructional and behavioral support decisions that we make first before we look at any staffing or how we're going to assign our teachers and our other staff. We want strong academic process and progress, and we should expect it. And these youngsters are members, not visitors of the school community. So this is the shift we're looking for. Now, let's go back, and I'd like to invite us now to look at in more detail those three phases. And this is where we're going to be giving you some tools. In each of these phases of evolution, we're going to talk about some of the data, some of the concerns and challenges, And then you'll be receiving a number of tools and resources that many of them are very, very practical. You can use them tomorrow in your classroom or in your school. So beginning then with our physical inclusion, let's look at that more in depth. The question here is, within physical inclusion, are all the students sitting in the right seats? Now, again, with being more inclusive, we look at the neighborhoods and looking at services for children who are diverse in race, culture, language, looking at our Dispro. We're going to look at the neighborhood school as the first reference point. Unless very compelling reasons, every child should be educated in their neighborhood school. If it's a very, very low incidence need, then there may be a reason to bring some of those youngsters together. But the smarter we are about what we're doing, the less often that is necessary. The general ed classroom, remember, is the reference point. So what we're going to be looking at are all of our youngsters, are the majority of our youngsters with disabilities, or that are children of color, or any other children who are experiencing poverty, just on and on down that list. Are they predominantly and successfully served in the general ed class? And do we have those individual supports that are provided and needed for those youngsters that are needed? Okay, so this is the whole piece of physical inclusion. Where are they sitting? So let's look back. Remember this definition? We looked at it a little while ago, of the categories of looking at disproportionate representation. This is, of course, a particular concern in California schools. Now, let's look at the first piece of data. You recall that one of those four categories said, are we disproportionately identifying children of color or any particular group as youngsters who are in need of and eligible for special education services? Well, in this case, African American students in California make up 5.47% of the total school-age population, and yet they represent 8.42% of the population. So that's a pretty disparate difference of percentage. Important to pay attention to. If you look at white students, there's virtually no difference in their percentage in special ed, and there's percentage on the total population. That's true for most every other group, and you've been making real progress for most other groups. So we need to really focus on this. Even our Latino children, their representation in the total population is closer and closer, and making some real strides in being the same percentage as are identified as children with disabilities, or close. The next question, remember, when we looked at disproportionality, is a particular group over or under-identified in a particular category, disability category? Well, look at the numbers here. Again, while African American students make up only that 5.47% of the population, look at the next pie chart. Whoops. However, 14% or 13.5% of those youngsters are identified as having within the category of emotional disturbance. Way disproportionate to their percentage in the population. The next piece is, you recall, are they disproportionately identified or have more punitive remedies or decisions made about their services? All right, and they're, in this case, suspension rates. Now, the good news for California is in the last 5 years, and congratulations, in the last 5 years, your suspension rates have slowly lowered, and you are making good progress there. But look at this visual. Is there a population for whom that we have an extraordinarily high, continued high rate of suspension? Yes, African American students. Look at the difference and ponder. Here's what I want you to think about. This is a very critical question. Do the answers to that question, what is causing that, have to do with adult issues or with student issues, or a combination of the two? But I had a mentor for years that always said to me, Frances, in education, the burden is not on the child, it's on the system. So that's why we're having, yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we had a comment that is really addressing this issue, and I hope that you can perhaps respond to it. It says, we believe strongly in the bedrock beliefs, but also believe that we need to be blind to race and ethnicity when a student's needs absolutely cannot be met in a general education class or a general ed school. Violent students of color or who are white, whose needs have not been adequately addressed by behavior intervention, should be able to have their needs met in a separate setting. Demonizing separate specialized settings hurts, does not help students in extreme need, no matter what their skin color. Can you respond
Absolutely.
to that?
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you. And I appreciate, Jackie, your comment. Thank you very much. Remember is that there are 2 points that we've made that I think should be addressed. One is that I am such a proponent of inclusive practices and serving children wherever possible and appropriate inside a general ed classroom. And remember, underline appropriate. So let's recall that, one, we need to be able to make individual decisions that are appropriate for students. And so if you ask me the question, Frances, are there students today, who at this time, and I always put that qualifier, at this time, regardless of what we've tried to do in the general education classroom in terms of instructional strategies and behavioral strategies and all the different supports and services that we thought could be provided, are there students that when we look at them individually, we say at this time they would benefit from much better a setting that is separate, quieter, more structured, staffed differently, you name it? And my answer is yes, you bet. We definitely have youngsters for whom that is the appropriate setting. So no question. But here comes, and I think it's been helpful and to look at some of the data, and we'll go further. But disproportionate, what that then says is for individual students, yes, it is appropriate for some of those youngsters to need that. In fact, I would argue, and I'd go to court with you if that were necessary. But when we're faced with the data that we have in California and in my state and every other state, when we're looking at disproportionality, then we have to pay attention to the fact that we are disproportionately identifying students of color, not only as children with emotional disturbance, but as needing services in more segregated environments. So I want to be sure, I see your word on there, demonizing. No, I'm not demonizing a separate setting at all. In fact, I hope I'm not demonizing anything. What I am saying is that this data should at least cause us to begin asking those questions. And we're going to go a little further in a minute, and I'll show you something else in terms of teacher expectations that I think will be important. But thank you for that question, and it gave me an opportunity to say something that at the end of this webinar, if I thought I hadn't said it, I would worry about it, and that is individual decisions based on the needs of individual students. And yes, if you believe in that, you do know that there are children of any race, every race. There's some children who do need a different structured environment at this time. I'm always hoping that we can that they can be successful as we move through their school career. Do you think that's answered it, or is there?
I think so. Thank you, Frances.
Okay, all right. And if not, you can call me later. I'd love to visit with you about it because it's a hot button. And let me also say while I'm at it that the teachers who are in those settings have one of the most challenging roles in school today. Absolutely. All right, let's look a little further. One of the things that I think, and I do want you to think too, this I meant to go back to this. This is a quotation up here on the screen that I really love. School leaders need to decide where they stand in relation to equity. And if they do not yet have passion for it, they must find some. Passion is a prerequisite to succeeding in a school with a diverse racial population. I think that stands on its own. I'm going to tell you something personal about me. All of my career, I have focused almost, well, exclusively on children with disabilities. And about 15, 20 years ago, I started noticing something when I walked down the hall that I hadn't really paid attention to before. The fact is, the practice had been there all along, but I didn't pay any attention to it. And it was that I would walk past some classrooms that would be predominantly filled with children of color. And in some cases, not a single white student would be in the room. And I'd walk past and I'd wonder, and I focused on what I was focusing on, and I realized at that point, and that was the beginning of a shift for me, that that there was something different. There was something unusual. There was something that we needed to think about. I actually have a diverse staff in my consulting firm, and I have individual consultants who are African American or Latino, and they began meeting with me and saying, Frances, are you noticing? And it was the beginning of a time where I realized, and this is just honest, courageous conversation, that my level of cultural proficiency was very lacking. I really had work to do. Now I'm talking about me, not talking about the rest of you. You have your own decisions to make. But I realized that I can't be concerned about the lack of equity for one group of youngsters if I'm not concerned about issues of equity for every group of students. So I'm with you, but I think let's go on to think that our data, our results on the belief, the bedrock beliefs. Wow, that you were so honest and so candid, and I agree with you. That's where we are in our schools. So belief systems have a lot to do with the way I may respond to diversity in my classroom, and we'll see that later. Okay, now here are some tools that I brought you. There are 4 of them. The first one is Guiding Principles of Inclusive Education. And one of the things that we've shared these with are school boards, and several of them in your state have actually adopted something that looks similar to this. And if you'll notice, we've talked about guiding principles about inclusive education, but the third bullet, for example, says that schools do not over-identify or assign special ed services to students of color disproportionate to their percentage in the total school population. Another tool that we put in here for you is this is a 3-page document because there are actually 9 different categories. There are quality standards for inclusive schools that we thought you might like to have, and we put it in a matrix. Another tool for you is a self-assessment tool for looking at inclusive practices, and this is probably the most relevant to our webinar today. A couple of years ago, in concert with Presence Learning, we created a webinar, and it's still available to you on their website. And this is a wonderful document that came from that webinar. And I'm going to tell you that while we put a lot of tools in this webinar for you today, the fact is that we put there's some different ones in this. And so some that I think you'll really like. One in particular that I like helps us develop authentic relationships with our students, and there's some little interview tools that teachers can interview each of their students. and build more of an authentic relationship with them. So I think you'll really like that one. All right, so those are the tools for that first phase of physical inclusion. Now let's look at academic inclusion, and that's not are all students sitting in the correct seat. It's are they all achieving? It's one thing to be in the right chair. It's really another thing to be able to demonstrate that our youngsters are actually learning and progressing well. Now, this is a really juicy one. It's very, very deep and thick in a lot of different materials. John Hattie's work, Invisible Learning. We're going to look at Tier 1 instruction, positive expectations, and culturally responsive instruction. So are they all achieving all relevant issues? Well, here's some more data. And in California, we know that from a study that was just completed and then recently referenced in an article, in California, only 10% of Black students and 15% of Latino students met benchmarks in 8th grade math compared to 44% of white students and 29% of students overall. So when we look at, yes, there is an achievement gap, and I want to bring your attention, this is really exciting stuff. These are some of my favorite books, but I want to focus on the last two, The Visible Learning, which are by John Hattie. Oh, he's incredible. He's my new hero, and he is a researcher that looks at the instructional strategies that make a difference or influence positive achievement. I want to also call on Parker Palmer. This is an incredible quotation. I think it really kind of guides my own practice. Teachers possess the power, and I'm a teacher, to create conditions that can help students learn a great deal or keep them from learning much at all. Teaching is the intentional act of creating those conditions. So intentionally, we as good teachers make choices about what strategies we use in our classrooms because we know some of them work and some of them are less than effective. Now, not long ago, I read this statistic, and I got to tell you, I had to rearrange my own expectations as well. The Hechinger report, and this is also an assertion by John Hattie, that, get this, at least 90% of all students with disabilities should be able to master on grade level content. Now, I would hazard to say that that low expectations for what youngsters with disabilities can accomplish is probably our single most difficult challenge as we try to progress in inclusion and other practices in schools. So, how is it possible that 90% of all students with disabilities should be able to master on grade level content? Well, let me quickly say that when you really break apart the 10, 12, 13% of kids with disabilities in your school, which is a national average of children with disabilities, and I think California is right up there in the 13%, 12, 13%. Over half of those youngsters tend to be children with learning disabilities. Another big chunk, the next biggest chunk, with a speech disability. Then you move on around, and you'd say certainly that would be the general curriculum. You move all around that pie chart of disabilities, and the next category would be children with intellectual disabilities, and that's a great, a wide band of abilities within that. And we've often always said with listen to that, often always, not possible. We typically say about children with an intellectual disability, oh, they won't be mastering on grade level content. And that may be actually the case for some, or maybe even the majority of that category. I'm not going to put numbers there. But we instantly think in some of our schools that I visit, you go down the hall, you're going to have a functional curriculum, you're going to go to the post office, you're going to do coloring time and puzzle time, and we watered down that curriculum so significantly. So we've got to be really careful of that. So keep going around. Children with emotional disturbance typically perform at or above grade level, but what gets in their way? If all of you are saying the behavior, you're right. So if you look at that, it's really possible that 90% of all students with disabilities will be able to master on-grade level content. But let's go a little further. This is John Hattie's work. I know it's tiny on your screen, but run out and get his book or print the materials that come with this. But the highest effect size, the average point at which a strategy shows itself to be successful or helpful in improving achievement is an effect size of only 0.4. Now look at his work. He sorts about 200 to 800, depending on the way you look at his data, of strategies by effect size. And look at the top #1 effect size strategy, teacher estimates of student achievement. Wow. So let's play with that a minute. Let's take that farther. Here are some of many guiding principles about high teacher expectations. The expectations of teachers toward their students have a great impact on students and their learning. When they have positive expectations, we know that all kinds of things are much more positive: self-esteem, achievement, attendance, motivation, and so on. So that's one thing, that we understand that teacher expectations do have an impact on student learning. Second one is this has become, and especially if you're a school that has disproportionate representation of children of color in special ed and in some of the more separate environments, we have to be aware that there's a differential outcome for students based on my attitudes or expectations, and I need to adjust them accordingly. Now, this isn't a course on expectations, but I'll just remind you that some of the things that we look for is that teachers give the same length of time when they ask a question of students, give the students the same length of time for them to formulate an answer, rather than moving more quickly away from a student that we don't think is going to have the right answer. We tend to, if we're not careful, ask the easiest questions for those that we have made assumptions would not be able to answer the more difficult questions, and so on and so forth. But let's look next at the third guiding principle, and again, these are the third one is failure of educators to expect positive outcomes results in a loss of access to learning and equitable opportunity. Again, if I don't call on students or I don't give them wait time for their thinking and so on, I am restricting their access to learning and opportunity to interact with the material. A lot of other different characteristics as well. But now, number 4. And effort-based, and you all know this is Carol Dweck and others, our growth-based mindset is a critical component of high expectations. Okay, with all this in mind, let's go back now, look at what John Hattie said was the highest of the 2017 study that he's done, the highest correlate, or has the highest effect size. And now I want to share the results of a study that is kind of adds some difficult, challenging detail to that. In this recent study, you can see here that the black students are indicated in the blue line and the white students in the red. So teachers overall, when asked their expectation for the level of education attainment of these two groups, you see that for the majority, teachers expected completion of a high school diploma and some college. But look at the difference when it looked at their expectations for children of color being able to complete at least a 4-year college degree. Boom, pretty big difference. So if I'm teaching my youngsters with that different expectation in mind, the first thing I know is that it's no secret. Every student in that classroom knows what our expectations are. Sadly, the students that we have low expectations for are also keenly aware. And so look at the difference, and then remembering that that is, and I'm going to say, it's been called a self-fulfilled prophecy. So as teachers, and courageous teachers, can we look at our own practice and say, and of our colleagues, are we inadvertently, because we want the right things for youngsters, but do we have some bias operating in our classrooms around the progress, the potential for completion of college for children of color? Okay, so here are the Carol Dweck's two concepts of ability-based or ability mindset versus growth mindset. And so if this is an area that you feel like you're needing to look at more and more information about, this is really very powerful stuff, and much literature exists on it. And so what we believe here is that intelligence in the growth mindset is not fixed. It grows and is influenced by, wait for the word, expectations, confidence, and effort. So that's another area for professional development that I think is very powerful. All right, so what are the strategies that help us as teachers, as educators, as educational leaders address bias-driven disparities? Training in empathy, empathic listening. You can read these. I'm not going to read them all to you, but I do want to say there's my culturally responsive instruction again. When I had my aha about 15 years ago, I really had to go back and get really steeped in this language and this literature so that I understood what it is I didn't know that could be harming youngsters that I work with and their teachers. Teacher reflection on our own practice. Authentic. I'm going to underline this bullet. Building authentic teacher-to-student relationships. Something different happens when teachers can find the way to take some time in our busy instructional day to connect with our students on a more personal level. Okay, so looking at the connection between effective instruction and behaviors, ineffective and unengaging instruction is the first suspect when behavioral disruptions emerge in the classroom. Now, I will admit that when I've done this work in disproportionality and I've talked with teachers and leaders, certainly there is a group, a subset of our colleagues whose answer is lack of support in the home, poverty, so on and so forth, and looking at factors external to those that we can impact as teachers. So I think I want to also say, what is it? Where are we looking to place external responsibility versus internal on the school? Because certainly one could argue that what we can control is what we need to focus on. So given that, I want to say that all of us, every single teacher, needs to look at how well we're focusing on good Tier 1 instruction. We shouldn't wait for something special or special ed to begin to look at those effective strategies for diverse learners. Everyone knows, and in California and every other state, that increasing diversity means that we have to have good, strong Tier 1 instruction for every single student. And so I want to say that I have a new continuum for looking at options, and I want to think about youngsters that we're maybe making decisions that they need to go down the hall for support, whether it's inclusion or looking at my disproportionate representation. The first question is, what am I providing inside my general education classroom? What are my instructional strategies? And do I have positive behavioral supports in my classroom? So that's critical. That's question number one. Now, in California and in many states, when you're looking at some of your data now for disproportionality, one of the predominant settings for those services is outside of the general education classroom, specialized support, something that's outside, down the hall, in a separate facility, a separate classroom. We've already acknowledged that for a number of youngsters, regardless of race or culture or language, that there is a need for some of our students to have that very specialized support. Absolutely. But do we go there next, or do we look at our other options, which are as well, before we get to that option, more in-class support in the general education classroom, and I'll also say even perhaps advanced support in the classroom. And what that means is with in-class support, adults are in there. There might be a co-teacher, there might be a paraeducator in the classroom supporting instruction, supporting what's going on for all kids. And so we're actually adding support, personal support in the classroom. Advanced support, something different. And really, I think we're spending recently really focusing on this as well. Sometimes the adults and the additional adults in the classroom aren't really that helpful or kind of in the way because that's not what's needed for those students. Maybe graphic organizers, maybe text-to-speech software in the computers, maybe a vocabulary or word bank prior to the introduction of the lesson. Things that can be done in advance that are prepared and available in that classroom. So this is a really important continuum. When we start with Tier 1, we only go to that blue circle if we have considered what options within these other places within services, within the general ed classroom might be even more successful for some of our youngsters. All right, so we have to ask the question, what happened to Tier 1? One of the tools I'm bringing you that you can download is something we just finished for Hawaii. The state of Hawaii has a new learning walk, and some of the first things that we put in that learning walk to go in classrooms and see what practices are in place is what Tier 1 practices do we see. Differentiated instruction, student engagement, and the use of accommodations and scaffolds and so on appropriately for the needs of the student. So that's something we're really needing to look at in addition to flexible grouping and other areas. You'll get this in your tool. You have the full document, and you can do your own learning walks in your own school or have teams of your teachers discuss which of these are we doing well and what do we need to add. One of the things that I want to discuss here is the whole issue of accommodations and modifications. I'm not seeing us use those to the extent that I think they'd be helpful. In an accommodation, we're not changing what the student is learning, but rather how they're learning through, as I said earlier, graphic organizers, text-to-speech, so on. And most youngsters have their needs met here, and this is not just about students who are identified as needing special ed services. Any student can have an accommodation. If I didn't have the graphic organizer or something visual for me as an accommodation, I think I'd still be back in 3rd grade. So it's for all students. Now, but the modification, that's a little bit more serious. When we're changing what the student is learning, we've taken them at least to some degree outside of that general education classroom. We need to know the difference between the two. We're often using those terms interchangeably. One of the instructional strategies that benefits all students is the effective use of instructional accommodations. So here are the tools for you for academic inclusion. I think you're going to really like some of these. They're some of my favorites. The first one is an accommodation rubric. I love this thing. If we're not using accommodations, and we have students, then we need to really rethink our basic instructional design for our lessons. But one of the things that we know is that for children with a disability, and this also may include an emotional disability or behavioral, where we need contracts or we need clarity about roles and rules within the classroom, whatever, then is the student using that accommodation? And if no, then here you have does not use all the way to use as regularly. Sometimes I find that we come up with a list of accommodations and we never review them again. The child has them in 1st grade and he has them in 12th grade. And so this is an opportunity every year to say, let's get rid of the ones that he's not using, that are not effective for him, that are stigmatizing, and so on. And then I think you'll find this to be a really useful tool. I'm going to reserve this one because you're about to see it again. It is multi-level instruction, which is a phenomenal strategy that says the better we design the lesson, the less we have to go to the right of that form and have to add accommodations or modifications. And I've got a really great little lesson planning tool for you that you might like. Now, this is the bedrock of our firm for inclusive practices. This is our favorite. It's divided into two parts. The first half are the instructional supports that are needed, and then the next half is the personnel that are needed. And I'm going to show you that we had advanced support, we have in-class support, and we have that specialized support, which means down the hall outside of the general ed classroom for those students who may need it. So you never go to the second half of the format until you've made decisions about what instructional and behavioral supports are needed. So I think you'll find this really, especially I use this if I have a child that's really struggling, a student that's really struggling. So there are the two parts. Let me take us to my next one. All right, here's what I find. If we skip the front half of this form, we are more likely to move directly to more pullout. So just as a thought, let's spend much more time in looking at those instructional decisions first. Now, the instructional design tool, one of my favorites, we did training in differentiated instruction for years, but what we found was that we had to come up with something that made it really easy for teachers to use it. So this actually form has all the elements of differentiated instruction in it, so that what am I teaching, and I need to pre-assess if I'm going to differentiate. Here are my strategies, and I can use a bank of 50, 60 different strategies. I need to mix up my grouping approach, and then notice the questions at the bottom. These are the same ones that were in that earlier form. Do I have any student that may not be successful in this lesson? And if so, who are they? And they don't have to have a label. And then do they need an accommodation? For some of my youngsters, is a modification necessary, and so on. So I think you'll really like this. It's really good for collaborative planning at a grade level or a department level approach. Here's what I promised. This is that learning walk that has a list of some of the most effective strategies for youngsters. And then here is the 7 components of an effective school-wide system for positive behavior. If we don't have a school-wide positive behavioral support system, this is an example of where I think it's an adult responsibility that we can look at youngsters and think, what could they do differently? But we haven't set up a system yet in our schools that make it easier to succeed behaviorally. So this is a really helpful form, I think, for people to look at. Now, one of the things that you want to think about too is removing those old places. I don't mean the places themselves. You still can go down the hall to specialized support when it's needed. But this was an example of something I talked to you about earlier, which is removing those place names and those places and those label-driven thoughts. This is a question that I ask myself. When I go into a school and when I'm responsible for some of those practices, if I see an awful lot of youngsters in pull-out situations, or if I see children of color predominantly either in a segregated classroom or among the statistics for suspension or expulsion, what's going on in our thinking? How did we arrive at that decision? And were we being totally student-centered? Or did we have preconceived notions about children of color or children with disabilities that have led us to that? My own reflection is sometimes I think we've confused segregation and expulsion as an effective approach for students. So again, just thinking about our own thought process as we reach those final decisions. And remembering my data, my California data about suspension, about over-identification in particular categories such as emotional disturbance. Now this last one is fascinating to me. This is the social, cultural, and racial inclusion. As we talk about children identified with a disability, now think if I'm over-identified as having an emotional disability or an intellectual one, then it's true that my struggle to be a member of the school community is much greater. I'm suddenly a special ed student or a behavior student or whatever, and my struggle to be a member, along with all my peers, of that school community just got a lot more difficult. So we have parents of children with disabilities who tell us that their children are not on the roster or not on the invitation list for birthday parties or socials or get-togethers or bowling or anything that involves a life outside of school. We also know that that's true because this question is, are the students full members of the school community? Remembering we started with, are they in the right seats? And are they achieving? Are they full members? So I want to kind of start putting a bow. I see we're kind of close on time, if I'm right. And I want to start putting a bow around this presentation on something that I think goes back to us as adults. We're going to have to pull out those bedrock beliefs and have some real discussions. What are the underlying issues if in a school we say, not my kids, or that student doesn't belong in school? The numbers tell us that there's something beyond objective that is likely occurring in those decisions. In fact, most is. I sidestepped that. That something beyond purely objective would have to be considered when we're looking at the statistics of disproportionality in our schools. So we're going to have some really safe environments to have those conversations. I'm never as nervous, personally, when I conduct a workshop or a training session on cultural or racial issues around education, because we are not typically comfortable in discussing those kinds of issues with each other. The Glenn Singleton book, Courageous Conversations About Race, is well named. But in order for California or any other state to get to the bottom of this disproportionality, we're going to have conversations about implicit bias, about those adult issues that may be obscuring our thinking about the possibilities for children of color. I put this, there's some really good stuff in the Special Olympics, believe it or not. It's when I say in terms of disproportionality, I am amazed at the quality of their materials and resources. I know it sounds as though it's for children with just intellectual disabilities, but there's a huge section in there that talks about how to put all students in leadership roles in our schools. Really relevant to our topic of disproportionality. There's a lot of different resources that you'll want to look at. So in this third component, looking at the impact of cultural bias, here's my thought. If we as teachers, when we recognize that if we do have biases that we're either not aware of or in some cases we are, and that we don't aggressively deal with and eliminate those from our own practice, I think that it's more difficult for us to justify that when we look at what those attitudes do to children. All the research tells us, all of it, that it results in developing feelings of worthlessness, achieving less in school, lower aspirations for the future. We know that. Lower aspirations for even completing college. Much higher likelihood of dropout, and I will tell you, I would drop out myself under those conditions. I would not want to stay in school. And so this is a huge key to our dropout rate, but also to the danger of separation and suspension and expulsion. And that disproportionality doesn't result in some abstract impact. I sometimes do focus groups with young people and ask them how this is felt to them or what their reactions are or how this changes their feelings of school. And no educator could sit through a focus group of that nature and not be triply committed to really looking at what we can do and changing these data for ourselves. So what I have in the way of tools for you here is there's some great articles on social justice. This is the part, this piece right here, really pull this out. These are 6 exercises you can adapt to be used for faculty meetings around the issues of shared responsibility. Candidly, they were initially developed around inclusion of generically children with disabilities, but as we look at our issues today, they're easily adaptable either as they are or with small adaptation for you to use with your faculties. This is a great checklist for teachers. I would do it individually. How do I rate myself on these behaviors for building authentic relationships? Now remember I said we were going to come back to this. Inclusion is not about disability. Remember, it's about the kind of our race or any one of the other areas that distract us from the work in school. It's about the kind of world we want to create and live in. It was almost like it's supposed to happen. When I was looking for my ending for this presentation, I opened up Ed Daily and I read a magnificent article that, if you'll remember, I said that when we're coming down to that 4th one, what is the gap between what is and should be? And so let me share with you the 5 points made in this article. What we have to commit to personally is look at our own personal assumptions, beliefs, and behaviors. We've got to publicly model a personal belief system that's student-centered. There we go back to those bedrock beliefs. We have to act with cultural competence, and if we don't know what that is yet or are not familiar with the literature, get into it. It will be some of the most fascinating work and the most growth-producing that you'll do, I think, if your experiencing it matches mine. Confront and alter institutional biases. When you see those occurring, we have to call them out. To say nothing is to agree, and certainly to create systems and structures that promote equity. I really am very grateful to this author and her article just this last October, Michelle Shannon. So I will end with this. In her work, she said, school integration has and will continue to face resistance at every turn. But it's got to be a critical part of our school system's efforts to close the achievement and opportunity gaps. As leaders, we can each anchor our work in these dispositions and use them to find a way to enter this work. Each of those 5 or any other you want to add, but look at the last statement. Our children can't afford for us not to. I thank you so much for your attention to this webinar and to the points raised. You may not agree with every piece, but I think we'll all agree with the fact it's important work, and it's important self-work. So I'll leave you with reminding you that the first week of December every year is National Inclusive Schools Week. Log on if you'd like. There are lots of free tools. There's a giant way to celebrate Inclusive Schools Week. And our theme this year is Kaleidoscope of Friends. There's all kinds of activities for teachers to use to celebrate that. And finally, I just want to end by thanking all of you for your decision to participate and for everything that you do every day. Education and teaching and leadership are some of the toughest roles there are in our society. I just happen to think they're some of the most, or the most important. Thank you for what you do.
Thank you so much, Frances.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you so much, Dr. Stetson. We're so grateful for the time you took to create this webinar for us and to share your vast knowledge with our participants throughout California. It really gave us a lot to think about and to reflect on. We will be having another webinar on January 26th with Dr. Sean